Hello, I am Corey Kerr,
And I'm Joshua Kemble.
and this is the Indie Review Show.
This is the series where we review the best of indie comics and other media like movies, TV, cartoons, books. And did we mention comics? The idea is we're pulling back the curtains on our inspirations.
Josh and I have been professional illustrators, cartoonists, animators, graphic designers, and we've taught creative arts courses at the university level, and we're getting into things that we will pull and use in the next art that we create.
I love it.
So what are we doing today, Josh?
So we're going to be doing a review of Further Grickle by Graham Annable. And before that, we got to kind of get into our plugs. So, like what kind of work, like where do you want to guide people to kind of check out your work before we get into analyzing this great work? And I'll also have a little short story. Sorry, I'll have a little short story about Graham and how I found out about his work as well before we get.
Cool. Yeah. So for plugs, we're doing website and one thing, right? That's
exactly.
So you can find my stuff at coreykerr.com. And the one thing that I would like to plug is that I am about to finish Unchained Aggression with Jim Lujan, and you can check that out if you go to coreykerr.com/online and then click on the Unchained link there. We've got a whole show where we kind of showed what we're doing. What would you like to plug?
I'm excited about that animation. I would like to plug this book right here. Boom. Which is 2 stories. It's my comic about faith and mental illness that's hand lettered, hand inked, 122 pages, and you can get it on Amazon.com. And then joshuakemble.com is where you can find my work. So yeah, that's my plugs.
Cool.
All right. So I want to kind of real quickly, we're trying to kind of keep this on time, so I don't want to make this a long story. But when I was a young cartoonist, I had self-published a comic called Numb that got like the Xeric grant. And at the time, there was this small indie publisher called Alternative Comics, run by this guy, Jeff Mason. And he helped distro a lot of Xeric Award winners' books. So he'd help you get into like Diamond and distro it to stores. So basically, after you did your print run, you'd ship it to him, and he'd kind of you didn't ship it to him, you'd ship him a couple of copies, and then he would tell you where to ship all your stuff for the Diamond distro and all of that. The advantage there being, even though you're self-publishing, you were listed in Diamond under Alternative Comics, and so you'd get like the reputation of that publisher to kind of boost your sales, which was really cool. So my first convention I did with that book was Alternative Press Expo in San Francisco in 2007. And Jeff very kindly was like, hey, don't pay for a booth, just booth at the Alternative Press booth. So I go to the Alternative Press booth, and there's this guy, Graham Annable, and then another guy named Scott C. Scott C is really well known now, so is Graham. But they're like kind of people I'd never heard of in comics, but they were hilarious people. And they had like a line out the door, and I couldn't understand it because Alternative Comics did not have like crazy sales numbers. So it was just weird. But then they did this anthology, like that was a floppy comic called Hickee. And it was one of the funniest things I've ever read. And I was instantly in love with all of their work. So that's how I discovered Graham Annable. And I remember at the end of that convention, basically like my wife and I, when we were considering moving to Portland, I reached out to Graham. He let us stay in his house and like kind of get a vibe of the city. And that's where I got a copy of Further Grickle. And there's one story in particular that's at the end of this. So once I start getting into this, pay attention to this last story. It's 10 stories. And there's the last story just like blew my mind. Like the whole style and execution of Graham Annable's work is really interesting, and we'll kind of get into like the meaning and all of that as I get to it. But that's the really quick rundown. I hope it was really quick. So yeah, anything before we get there, or I think we're good to go, right? Let's see. Oh, Corey, you're muted.
Sorry. Because this one's a little bit different. Do you want to go through the same thing where you do characters first and then plot the story, or do you, since there's 10 stories, you just want to go through 9 and then kind of?
So I'm going to be breaking down story by story. I'll introduce it in that structure, but by story as opposed to as a whole. Because I think if I try to do all the characters in every story, because it's 10 short stories, I think that'll be really confusing. So,
Okay.
So we're going to structure it kind of by story. And here, let me pull that book up and then move my mic and we'll get rocking. So, okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, I can hear you good.
All right. So, and hopefully you get a good view of this. If it goes off screen or something, let me know. So like I said, the artist in this book is Graham Annable. The book is Further Grickle. He's a Canadian cartoonist and animator. He's the creator of Grickle. He, like I said at the top, he's published by Alternative Comics, which was an indie publisher that no longer exists, that was run by Jeff Mason. And I'm trying to think of it's a great publisher and it's worth checking out. There are other titles, but the neat thing is you can still buy this on Amazon, and we have a good link on the irsagency.com where you guys can kind of check that out. So, and then here's, when Graham gave it to me, drew a little Grickle for me, which is cool. So, Annabelle's created works for television, film, video games, comic book industries. And what I'd recommend, like if you're interested in this, you can also check out Grickle, another collection of his Grickle strips, which are like this little character that were put out by Dark Horse. And then he also has a whole series of children's graphic novels called Peter and Ernesto that are sloths. They're 2 sloths, and it's for kids. And it's great. And then, of course, he's really well known as being the co-director of the movie Box Trolls, right? So that's a little bit about that. So let's get into it. So I guess before getting into it, let me just give the overall plot, right? So Grickle's a collection of silent, subtle, slice of life stories, and they're told in this like elegant but simple execution of style. I'll just kind of thumb through it so you guys can kind of see. They're told in this very simple way, with a dark kind of poignant twist that comments and hints on like a deeper meaning for the human condition. So they'll start off kind of light, and usually with like a typical slice of life scenario. And then from there, they kind of take on like this much deeper meaning that kind of makes it a little like either poignant or just hilarious. So, okay. So let's get into it. Okay. So here we got Further Grickle, right? Like I said, Alternative Comics. Okay. So, and I should mention the date that this came out. This was a while ago. So this was created in 2003. That's before I even published my first comic. Okay. So here we go. So the first story, it's a collection of stories, and you'll notice as I go through it, like they're kind of really well stitched together, but you're going to notice they're very simple stories. Like, I'll pull a little closer so you guys can see. So this one's called Living in the Moment. The characters are like this dude with a mustache who is a fascinating intellectual. You've got like this woman character that the intellectual is kind of impressing at a bar. And then you have our main character, right? And they're at a dinner party. Okay. So, and by the way, like one of the things I love about this book, and you're going to see throughout it, is it's staged very much in like an animation style where there's repetition of the same panel, where it's kind of focusing on the character movement and the character action. And what I hope you guys will gather from this as we go is you're going to kind of start seeing why Graham is such a heavy hitter in like story departments for Lucasfilm and Leica, because he's got like just this amazing command over simplifying characters down to almost a stick figure, and yet they're recognizable. The action is clear. The weight of the characters and the movement is clear. So just keep an eye on that as we go, okay? But you're not going to see a lot of like crazy paneling tricks in this comic.
It's also like super subtle. I mean, if you're looking at like just those first 3 panels, the guy in the middle,
yeah,
without even reading it, you can tell that he's interested in and flirting with the person on the right and kind of like tolerating the person on the left.
100%. And the beauty of it too is like he does that with the simplest line, and if the dot were off by like a millimeter, it wouldn't work. So this is the kind of work that when I was a young cartoonist, I would probably look at and be like, meh, I'm not that interested, you know, because I'd want to see like rendered crazy stuff. But the more I learn about cartooning and drawing, the more I look at this and I envy it, because it's very hard to pull this off. Yeah. So we've got, they're at a dinner party. The fascinating man is in the middle of the conversation. You're very right, Corey. He's very annoyed by this guy. He mentions something about Iowa, and the character kind of chimes in and says, like, I went to Iowa when I was 12. And he's like, interesting. So then the conversation moves on. He heads home. And then that night, our main character is like absolutely disturbed that he didn't make an impressive contribution to this conversation, right? So then we flash forward to the character over here building a time machine. And he uses the time machine, boom, and appears right back at the it's sad because these are so subtle. I hope I can kind of, maybe I'll move it in a little bit. So you know, he's back to this scenario, right, where he's like, I'm going to do this again and get it right. Okay. So then he comes in and he says something even more like long-winded and fascinating about Iowa, right? And once again, kind of fails to sort of impress. He impresses a little more, but once again, he gets home, he can't sleep. He's like, crap, I could have done that better. Let me pull this out a little bit just so you guys can see. And then he once again decides to use the time machine, go back, right? And we see that sequence repeat multiple times until years later, he has done this so often that he is now an old man. And he's finally got like the perfect retort worked out, and he says, Iowans are known to, and he dies. And the punchline is, you know, this woman's like, you know, oh my God. And this side character we haven't seen is like, who was that old guy? And then the character who's been unimpressed this whole time goes, an imbecile, right? So so that's the first story in the book. Obviously like humor. And one thing I want to be clear about too is like the downside of doing this with humor books is like when you overanalyze a joke, it can kind of lose the humor. Right. But I mean, hopefully you clearly kind of see this is a funny book. The thing I like about it is, you know, so in this, it's pretty clear meaning where, and I'll get into meaning on each story too. So I'll do characters, plot, and the meaning on each one of these. But it's probably better to leave the mistakes of the past in the past, right? Attempts to improve or obsess are kind of fruitless and deadly. So that's kind of the gist.
Josh, do me a favor and just zoom in on those last 3 panels in the lower right.
Yeah, and this is what people love about Graham Annabelle's work. He also, by the way, is very known because he was the art director for, so he was the lead story artist on like Monkey Island, and then he worked on Sam and Max for Lucasfilm. And then he also, like you might notice, these characters look very similar to an early Telltale game called Puzzle Agent that he actually kind of creates all the assets and story for. And he was the creative director of Telltale for like the first year when they were up and running. And he's also tied in with, now I'm going to blank out, so you have to tell me, Corey.
Double Fine Adventures.
Yeah, Double Fine, which his friend Scott C., I think, still works at. So, or at least the last time I was kind of following their work very heavily. So does that.
Gary Hodges says that Monkey Island is serious cred.
Yeah, and he is like once again, when you see this, if you were a young artist who didn't know how hard it is to pull off like a little stick figure like that that's clearly a different character from this, and they're so similar in template. It's like it would be hard to understand how he has those positions. But when you try that kind of like, I actually will just throw that out. Like if there is a cartoonist watching this who's like not impressed, like try working in this style and see how it fares, and you might kind of change your mind. So okay, let me see here. Got to pull open my notes again. Sorry. So okay, so let's get into story 2. There's 10 of these, so and I don't want this to go like 10 hours. So okay, so here's story 2, and you're gonna see this story repeat quite frequently. Like let me get back to where this is centered. It's pulling in a little too much. So this is Peeks the cat, and you're gonna see these little Peeks stories almost act as like bookends throughout the book. So in this case, the characters are Pete, this girlfriend, and then our main character, who's this random guy. So this story starts off, this cat is napping, a very wonderfully drawn, kind of very rat-like looking cat. I also will point out too, I love his like French line style, where it's clearly like brushwork. It's just really cool. Like the inks, I love it. Like the line kind of wiggles a bit. It's just a lot of fun. So anyhow, this cat kind of heads over to this restaurant that's having outdoor dining. A couple is having a very poignant conversation, and they're pretty much going through like this very dramatic breakup, right? And we see our cat, who's like our introduced character, and he's watching this go. It's a very like poignant breakup where, you know, he's basically trying to break up with his girlfriend or wife or whatever, and she's finally like, well, I'm glad that'll make you happy. And his response is like, well, maybe we shouldn't. Like, maybe I'm overcomplicating this, right? So it's this kind of very slice of life, like romance comic kind of thing going on. Finally, they leave. Neither of them have touched their food, and the cat, the ever opportunist down here, is in these last panels, like gets his food and eats and goes to sleep. So that's the first time you've seen Peeks, but the same kind of story is gonna kind of stitch the whole collection together. And I always like when that's done in like kind of anthologies or collections where there's like, it's almost like a it's almost like in music where you have like a repeated chorus or something. It kind of pulls the song together. So I like that a lot. However, so the meaning of that, I think indicates like the meaning of this book, which becomes clearer as you go. But it's basically like human drama, while it's compelling and important to the participants, is meaningless to nature, right? So it's kind of like highlighting the rather dark themes that are kind of underlying these stories, you know?
Yeah.
So it's very existential, weirdly enough. So, okay. How am I doing on time? Am I okay?
Oh, you're fine. Yeah. We're about 18 minutes in.
Perfect. Okay. So story 3 of 10, Dead Weight. This one's great. It's a little more complicated. We have these characters, Tom, who's like this tall character. You're going to notice that his character is much friendlier. And what I love about Graham's work is like, you can kind of tell their personality, like right off the bat. Like he looks a little clueless and friendly, right? And he looks kind of like short and angry and pissed, right? And that's exactly these characters. So,
which is fascinating because they both have lines that are like containment lines on the outside of the figure that are curving up and to the left. And yet the placement of the crux of that curve and the subtlety of the curve, or the exaggerated nature of the curve is changing it. And so the guy who's standing up, that line flows from like his knee all the way up to his mouth.
Yeah.
It's a very subtle curve, but the guy who's sitting down, it almost folds at the midsection, and there's several breaks along, and so you get like more jagged edges.
Yeah, and it's
all
literally
you need
like,
to show the difference is just the little eyebrow.
Yeah, and I mean it's even facially, it's like it's pretty much the same face template. It's just shortening the forehead, like changing the center line a little bit to be a little higher on the angrier character. It's it's really subtle cartooning that I think you have to really like. I think one of the reasons Graham is so popular as an artist, his personal work and stuff. He's also really well known. He did like a YouTube video called like I think Werewolf in Space or something, and it's his animations are the same. They're very simple and they're deceptively so. But anyhow, so I agree. I'm glad you noticed that line because that to me like that's it's weird, but it's like when I love Daniel Klaus, right? But I'm more intimidated by this than by Daniel Klaus on a drawing skill level. Isn't that weird? I don't know.
Yeah. And Gary's saying, I feel like you can tell that he's an animator.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, right? Because like the thing is, this is the ultimate structure to build an animation from. So like, once again, you can see how he works in so many story departments. But I also like, and I'll get into this more, but it's like what I pull from this a lot is like pacing and simplicity and framing. Like he gives you only the information you need, and he paces the story and frames it so beautifully. And then, of course, character acting, right? There's a lot of acting in these movements, So anyhow, so let's get into the story. So Tom, his short friend, we never find out his name throughout this entire story. And then we're also later on going to get introduced to this very annoying friend named Danny. Okay. So I will call him Danny the annoying driver. So here, basically, Tom and his short friend are waiting to get a ride for the party, a party they've been invited to. And his short friend is really pissed at Tom. He's very angry because he's like, why didn't we just take public transit, right? And Tom is kind of explaining this is a great idea. It's going to get us to the party faster. Public transit takes a longer time. And he's basically kind of like, first, kind of apologizing for Danny, who's apparently kind of an irritating character. And we'll see that as it kind of goes. But then eventually kind of reveals like, hey, when we get to the party, we'll probably just ditch the guy, right? Like we're just using him for a ride. And then we're introduced to Danny, the annoying driver. And I'm going to zoom in on this face just so you can see the humor in these strips. I mean, look at this dude. I mean, can you see that?
Yeah.
It's hilarious. So anyhow, and they're also kind of making fun of his way of speaking. And then of course, like they're like, well, he's gonna speak like he's British and say hello, gents. And like the first thing he does when he appears is go like, well, fancy seeing you gents here. So anyhow, so they get in this car. And they hop in the back of the truck, right? And he explains it. And I think this is just like smart framing and staging, which once again, I think is like that animation intelligence. Because Corey, you work in animation a ton, and it's like one of the big challenges in animation is coming up with really great backgrounds that are compelling, but can also be repeated a lot, right?
Yeah.
So here, I think he realized like this is going to build more tension for the later story to have it set in the back of this truck. So he kind of comes up with an excuse to put them in the back there. Like he says, like his passenger seat is being refurbished or something. But it's really, as an artist, just so you can create this tense scene in the back of this truck as they're driving. So let me see here. Okay. So, all right, so they kind of end up driving. They make small talk, and then basically through the small talk, they wind up. And once again, he has like these lovely moments of just like you can kind of see him kind of cluelessly being patient, waiting, and then you see this friend just get gradually more and more pissed. Right? He's just like, oh, I can't stand this guy. Finally, Danny kind of announces to them that like after talking about how he got his van and stuff, he explains through this long conversation that I'm kind of going through a little quicker, that that he's going to need to stop off and do a couple stop offs because he's at work, right? Like, so he's kind of doing this and he's going to do some stop offs for whatever he does for a job. So he takes off. He's like, okay, sit tight. I'll be back. And they sit there and they're kind of waiting. And we see the friend up here. Once again, staging. That's really smart. So you get this sense of like, okay, the friend's leaving. And then we just kind of see a conversation where once again, he's talking about Danny and how annoying he is. Kind of clueless friend suddenly looks out the window and notices something. And he kind of tells, so basically Tom tells his short, angry friend, like, wait a minute, there's a fight. I think he's getting into a fight out there, right? With like 3 guys. And so he, obviously being kind of the unloyal, like angry character, is like, let's just not go out there. He's just freaked out, right? And his friend is like, I'm going out there to help him. So you see him here doing like a battle run, like, yeah. and then like, once again, now we're left, and this is where the staging, like, I think there's a lot to learn in this comic about staging, because it's like the tension for just like a little stick figure type thing is kind of amazing, right? Where
well,
it's like
also like the idea of the blood in the gutters, or the, you know, the blood in the messenger, where I can imagine what's happening, but because they're not showing it to me, my imagination is way worse than, you know, what they draw in the style.
Totally. I mean, it's an old Hitchcock approach, you know, and like, because it's like, you know, a lot of people think Psycho wouldn't have been as frightening if they had actually shown the wounds in the shower, you know. It's a little scarier when you just see the knife coming at the camera and you're just imagining. So anyhow, this character is just freaked out and clearly seeing some kind of violence or horror. And finally, we see his friend get back, and his friend is just like a mess. And we don't see Danny, the driver. So he explains, like, Danny is not cold. He dragged him to the trunk. So he's like, you got to drive us to, like, he's asking, like, who were those guys? He's like, I don't know, but you got to get us to the hospital because Danny's messed up and I'm messed up, right? So now our short, angry friend is just like having to get to the hospital. They finally get to the hospital. They're in the waiting room. You can see his friend just is gone, you know? And I actually want to zoom in a little bit on this just to show the subtle brilliance of this art. Like, it's hard to do this. Like these two, I mean, look at that line work.
Yeah. So the line quality changes to a very broken, kind of shaky, as if it's interesting to me that I think people can intuitively understand what the illustrator is feeling as they do stuff. And I mean, to do a line like that, you'd have to have your hand be shaky and unsure.
Yeah.
And so it adds some instability to his figure to have that line quality go from these very confident, solidly weighted lines, you know, with a little bit of variation in weight, but no break in the direction. They're very fluid and gestural. And then you go to this shaky, hunched over figure where like it's drastic thick to thin transitions and a very wiggly line. I love that. That's so cool.
Yeah, and then from a story structure standpoint, like there's a lot of commonalities between this and like comedy writers like the people who write Curb Your Enthusiasm. It's kind of a bit where, you know, what starts out as a typical story, like an everyday story, like guys getting a ride to a party, suddenly becomes absurd and chaotic. And it's like you're kind of just following characters trapped in a totally absurd situation that should be normal, right?
Yeah.
And I just love that about the themes in this. So, okay, so Danny finally gets him to his friend finally gets to the doctor, you know, who comes and gets him, like the nurse comes and gets him. And he says, I'll be waiting right here, Tom. And then we get the bit. And here's what I love about this. And this is one of the things I'm going to bring up later, but it's patience and timing. So like once his friend's taken off panel, we're left with the character waiting. And so we're kind of in theory, like sitting with him at the waiting room. And then he looks at his watch. But like by the time it gets there, you're feeling that too, right? You're like, come on, you know?
Right.
And then finally the punchline, I'm never going to make it to that party now. So he was right all along. So this has multiple meanings. Like to me, you know, one of the main ones is like this character who's sort of selfish and shallow remains selfish, shallow. And I think that's like, could be read as like selfish people kind of remain selfish even after extenuating circumstances. And then also the funny bit behind this is like, you know, sometimes a gut instinct not to hang out with someone is dead on, right? Where it's like this guy didn't want to go with them because it was going to expand the amount of time for them to get to this party, potentially not get them there. And then he ends up being dead right. And his friend who didn't believe it got beaten the crap out of because he was wrong, right? So it's got multiple layers. This one's weird. This is probably my least favorite of all the stories. Although I love the style and it subtly changes a little bit. He uses some halftones and gets a little thicker with it. But this one, our character is What a Mess Pete. And this is just a nursery rhyme about a guy who gets everything wrong but has good intentions. However, I don't know if this is intentional or not. I tend to think it might be because when I read this book, it kind of layers on layers of meaning that by the time you get to the last story, which is the main one I want to focus on, like this almost feels like it's foreshadowing the story that's the 10th story that's by necessity, which is the 10th. So
Josh, we're over halfway through.
Okay.
Just to give you an idea. So you've got about 15 minutes.
All right.
To get to where you want to be.
All right. So let's slam through these. Okay. So this one's one of my favorites just for humor. This one fits the least well in the anthology, but it's probably the funniest of the collection. So let's go through it. So we have this character, Uncle Gerald, who's this kind of old sailor looking dude with like a corncob pipe. And then you have his nephews, right? And then you have eventually these characters called the children of the gas. What? My wife's probably going to crack up because this one's funny. But this is probably the funniest story in the anthology, but it doesn't end up having that kind of poignant end to it that like a lot of these do, where it goes a little further. But it's still, to me, this one had me in tears, like when I was reading it. 'Cause it's so funny. So, okay, we have the nephews. They're playing their board game. The uncle comes and sits down and rips just a massive fart. And it's hard to see on the screen, but he actually lifts his butt when he's farting. And his nephews go like, "That's disgusting." And he goes on to tell a story about how it's nothing. There's nothing disgusting about farting. And you're just releasing the child of the gases. And the kid's like, "Child of the gases?" And he goes, "Yes, one of the children of the ether." And then goes into this long story of the children of the gases. So he's telling the tale, like an old wise sage, of these gases that start in your belly. And they're born timid and cheerless, and they're crying because they're stuck in your stomach in this hellhole. And their tears are what cause your belly aches, right? And so it's like, then you have to, you know, the children don't know the joy that awaits just outside. A push is what they need, is this last panel. Let me kind of pull up a little bit. So finally, we see after the push, these poor children of the gases, you know, realize who they are, that they're higher beings released through pressure out in the world. They float into the sky, and they are welcomed by generations of gas folk. And that forms the billowing clouds that are set above our heads. So he finishes that story and is like, "All right, I'm going to go see what your mom's up to in the kitchen." And the kids are like, "Dude, the room smells." So it's pure fart humor on a meaning level, playing off the trope. Like, so for basic humor, like it's playing off the trope of children, an old man telling children a story of wisdom, turning it on its head, scatological humor, right?
Right.
And again, it's out of place in the collection, but I'm glad it's there because it's funny. And if someone can't laugh at a fart joke, they're really not acting in good faith, you know? All right. So we have another Peeks the cat story. This one I'll go through really quick. It's basically the same premise. Peeks wakes up from a nap and wanders into this outdoor break area. And our characters are Peeks the cat, Jarrett, and then this elderly coworker that we never really quite find out the name of. They're having lunch, and the elderly coworker is basically bemoaning automation, and that, you know, there's younger people at the job, and he's not going to be able to keep up with like the new programs that they have to learn, right? So he goes through this whole thing. He's lamenting it. They go, we got to get back to our work. Our break's over. Peeks the cat, kind of seeing opportunity in human misery, sees the open lunch bag that was left, gets the lunch, and then crashes and falls asleep. So that's that story.
And those speech bubbles are phenomenal.
Well, sorry, what?
The speech bubbles are phenomenal.
Oh, yeah. I love it. I also just love the Stedman-esque. Like this one in particular is very like Ralph Steadman-esque, where it's got a lot of splatter and kind of wiggly lines to it. Okay, this one's very simple. This one's called Round Trip. Now we're on story 7. And the plot is this man gets convinced that he needs to get on a plane and he may not come back. And we never really find out if this is like a friend or a lover, like this character bringing him cupcakes. But he abandons whatever this character is, friend or lover, gets on a plane. He's not going back. The friend's dismayed. He finally gets to his destination, realizing he's not happy, heads on a plane back. The friend is just utterly depressed, or lover, or whatever character that is. He returns from his trip, and then we see a reunited Joy. And then here he is eating cookies from that friend, and he goes, I might take a train. So we start seeing this is a cycle where this guy is like happy in his relationship or friendship, and then he kind of abandons, sees he's unhappy, returns, and it's just an endless cycle. So yeah, I mean, the meaning of this isn't like super deep. It's just the cyclical grass is greener nature of relationships, the urge to travel for something better only to find what we left wasn't actually good, and kind of just general discontentment. So that is story 7. Story 8 is Walk-In. This one's a very like slapstick bit. I hope I'm okay on time. This might take a little bit. We'll see. How are we doing on time?
We're 38 minutes in.
Okay, I think I'm still good. Okay, so Walk-In, the doctor. So we have the characters of, we'll eventually meet Dr. Felton, who we'll see in a bit, the receptionist, who we'll see in a bit. Actually, you kind of see her here. And then this character, Billy Billet, which is a great comedic name. And so he goes to the doctor because he has this terrible cough, which is excellently illustrated. It's just literally sketched. And we find out that he's going to a doctor who is friend, and I think his friend's name is Tim, recommended, right? So he goes through this dull waiting period process. And by the way, this is the funniest form you'd have to fill out at a waiting room, where it says, "What is your name?" And he's like, "Well, that's easy enough." And then when he finally brings it to the clerk after it, she's like, "Did you write your name?" Anybody who's been to a doctor's office, I think that's pretty funny. So he waits for the doctor. He finally shows up. And this doctor, Dr. Felton, I mean, he's clearly in distress, right? And once again, there's a lot of patience to this because it's a waiting room bit. Like he picks up a magazine, you know, so we see a lot of repetition. So finally, doctor's going to see him. First door on your left. We see him happy. He walks. And like, once again, I love these little bits where it's like you see the receptionist look at her form and then look back, and then it cuts. I like that patience, you know? Yeah. So, okay, here he is. He's waiting at the waiting room. And just the character animation in this is so like clear that this person's observed and waited at waiting rooms, you know? This Dr. Felton shows up. He he kind of basically hears him out about like his symptoms, and then finally he starts after hearing him out, basically asking him to. First thing he asks him to do is like grip your hand in a fist and like hold it as tight as you can, put as much pressure as you can, and then he just keeps going tighter, clench, tighter, right? Finally, he's like, I don't think I can do this anymore. My hand hurts, and he's like, okay, here, hands him a crate of peaches, and he's like, okay, now just start eating as many peaches as you can, right? So he eats all the peaches. Finally, here. After he's like getting sick from eating all these peaches, and he's like, I just can't eat anymore. I'm getting really full. He's like, fine, hold this pinwheel and blow. And I love this for comedic timing, but it's like, so he's blowing the pinwheel, and then the doctor kind of shows up and starts patting his stomach. He's like, stop. Okay. And he's like, look, Dr. Felton, this isn't really. And once again, we kind of move through this whole sequence where finally he kind of gets him to stay still until he finally gets down to this Zen-like state where our patient is really relaxed. And then he, with a football helmet, runs into his stomach, right? So this doctor has clearly like knocked him down. He takes off the thing, and he then starts pinching the character like painfully and twisting. Until finally he just flips out and goes, stop it, and like just hits him, right? Cracko. And he's like, that hurt. And then he looks down at the doctor and he thinks the doctor's dead. So he, in self-defense, like hit the doctor, thinks he's dead. He bails, right? This is where that little receptionist looking the other way thing makes sense, because it's kind of putting in a call and repeat later on. Like he knew this bit was going to come where the guy ran past the receptionist. So it's like, and in this case, the receptionist isn't even looking like his way. So anyhow, So finally he gets out, calls his friend, tells him this terrible experience with the doctor, with these great, just once again, the visual acting in this, which is really important in comics, I think is just on point. And he's just furious on the phone. And finally, his friend goes, well, that happens every time you go to the doctor. Like, that's why I recommended him. Like, he does that all the time. You'll think he's dead. And he's like, do you still have symptoms? And he finds out he doesn't. So he's relieved and thanks his friend. And there we go, right?
Yeah.
So that's that story. Sorry, these are... So, I mean, it's sheer absurdist humor. It takes an ordinary scenario and mixes it with the absurd to bring the funny, right? So it's like a normal scenario of like going to the doctors where it escalates to absurdity.
Right.
And then sometimes what hurts and is angering and frightening can be the best cure, right? We have another Peeks the Cat story. I know we're running low on time, so I'll just zoom through this one. It's just two old ladies. One of them lives at an old folks' home. Peeks kind of approaches their car. They're sitting in a car, and they're lamenting that, like, this poor grandma, which once again, she just gotta love what he can do with like really simple lines. Like, you know, everything about that character, you know?
Yeah.
But anyhow, so they're sharing a sandwich, and she's complaining about never getting, like, she's losing her memory, and the old folks home doesn't take good care of her. And basically, like, her relatives don't even send Christmas cards or anything like that. Her friend gets freaked out because the sandwich she's eating is like really bad. And the lady kind of reveals, because she's kind of senile and older, that it's like the meat is like months old. And so she kind of goes, okay, we're getting you back to the old folks home, throws the sandwich out the window, and Peeks, once again, the opportunist in human misery, shows up and steals the food. But this time, Peeks dies because the meat's bad. So that's the bookends of Peeks. And then we get to the final story, which is the one that I think this story is worth buying this book for. I mean, I think all the other ones are great, but you could actually publish this story alone. And it does things on all kinds of levels. So let's get into it. How are we on time?
We're good. You have 15 minutes.
Perfect. That's perfect. Okay, so this is by necessity. And first off, I love just the subtlety of how this story is bookended, like how it begins. It's kind of just a poetic picture of leaves. And that also is a really great way to kind of start like what will be a very slice of life, true to life type of narrative. And I do feel like this is when Graham Annable like leveled up, and all the work he's made since it takes on a totally different, more profound level than like the fart joke, although he'll still dip into the fart joke, you know? So, okay. I just love that it's subtle, quiet, funny, and then eventually poignant. And I think I've mentioned this to you before, Corey, but I feel like with storytelling, you can get to more tragedy through humor than you can through tragedy.
Yeah.
So anyhow, so we have this character. I'll explain the characters. So the main character is unnamed. Like you'll notice this a lot. And I think a lot of times he'll just call these characters Grickle. Like if it's the guy who's unnamed and he's the main character, that's Grickle, right? And then Billy Joel is going to be his dog, which we'll meet later. Sharon is his girlfriend, who we'll meet. Mrs. Anders is his elderly neighbor. And then Cheeves is Mrs. Anders' pet wombat. And we're going to meet all of those characters eventually. But we start with him trying to fix a rake, right? And his wife looks out the window, and we find out from this exchange of dialogue that he's clearly been out here with the intention of raking the yard, but he has been literally sitting for hours just trying to kind of fix like a bent part of the rake. So we kind of just immediately, just from that story choice, you know, this is a person who probably prolongs and delays needed things, right? Like is a procrastinator. Then we have the dog, Billy Joel, run out, and the wife kind of says he needs exercise. Billy Joel, he's working on the yard, and we find out now we have the neighbor in the classic kind of neighbor shot, like peeking over the fence, saying, "Hey, keep that dog out of my yard." The dog, Billy Joel. So then we find out through this exchange with Mrs. Anders, who I'm going to get a close up of this character. Look at this character. You see that?
Yeah.
Just the lines and the character, it's just so true to like the sort of character that would be talking about their pet wombat. But there we get an introduction to Cheeves, the wombat. This old lady is attached to Cheeves. She's like 15 years old. She's worried that her pet wombat is going to get mauled to death by his dog, Billy Joel, which is a great dog name.
And the simplicity of the hairstyle and the wrinkles in her neck and around her eyes.
Yes.
Aging her like 60 years older than Grickle is crazy.
Yeah. It's insane.
So good. And the fact that she's got a pattern on her clothing. Because so far we haven't really seen
and a pillbox hat, right? You know?
Yeah. Right. That's so good.
Yeah, so this wombat, which I love the character of that too, we find out she's worried about the wombat. She keeps it in a cage in her backyard. So he is basically saying, like, don't worry about Billy Joel. He just wants to play with your wombat. And she's like, no, that's a monster. So she's like, just keep an eye on it. Keep it out of my yard, you know? So he goes back to raking his leaves. He finally finishes. He's like, how can I work with improper tools? He's getting stuck on that bent rake again, right? And this is like one of those things that's like seems like a subtle story moment, but it has so much meaning for this character that he's stuck on something, right?
Yeah.
And it's distracting him from what he needs to do. I love that about this. I love that it's really subtle. So that's what I mean by subtle, even though some of it's very cartoonish. So then he's raked up this leaves. Billy Joel runs through the leaves, scattering his work. He's angry, gets over there and gets back to the leaves. Once again, just ignoring the thing he should pay attention to, the dog that his neighbor literally said, don't let in my yard. And now we hear down. And we find that Billy Joel has gotten into the yard. The old lady is frightened and freaked out, holding her precious wombat. And it's just full out. Basically, through this whole conversation, we find out that she is threatening to sue if anything happens to her wombat. And then she puts him back in the cage, right? He is just like, all right, he's got his dog, heads back to his house, to his wife to kind of tell his wife what just went down.
Okay, wait, go back real quick though, because there's one thing you haven't pointed out yet.
Oh, yes.
And I keep catching, go back one page.
Sorry.
I keep catching little bits of this, but like this is a great example. Incredible writing too.
Yeah.
Like the way that upper right-hand panel, gently, my jewel, gently into your cage you go. Like the proximity of those words into each other and the large gaps of negative space, like help the pacing. And it feels like that took some time to say because of the way he laid out the letter.
Totally. Yeah. The paneling is brilliant. I also like that it's somewhat freeform, but it's very easy to read because I see people attempt this and just not do it as well.
Because there's subtle things like the descender on the Y and the ascender on the T that fit nicely together, and the T and the L are aligned vertically.
Totally.
It can feel random and haphazard, but it's not aesthetically jarring.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So he's returned home, and now we're introduced to more properly introduced to his girlfriend Sharon, right? And Sharon, through this conversation, and I love this because this is just classic staging for anything. Like if you have characters talking, having them do like a day-to-day action where you have to have some exposition is really smart. So just having him go to the fridge, open some milk, pour some milk during this whole dialogue, I just want to say, like on a story level, that's smart. But anyhow, he's basically explaining to her like, hey, we're going to get sued if your dog gets into the other yard. And we find out also that they're not married, that she's his girlfriend, that she just recently moved in, and this dog came with her, right? And we also get the information through really subtle dialogue that he's between jobs, and so that's making him worried about getting sued. And let me see. Okay, so and so finally, like we've learned some core things. Like we realize he's out of work, right? And that she, through very subtle, like I'm trying to find. Okay, that dialogue doesn't happen until later, but okay. Oh, and once again, she even thinks like he's not going to hurt that wombat, right? This dog's just wanting to play. So okay, so we get to Grickle. He's on the couch. This is clearly later, right? Change scenes, and she comes by. Sharon comes by, asking him what he's doing. He's watching a documentary. I do want to just highlight these simple characters and how much is said by like where they sit. I mean, like, so now they're sitting across from each other almost as if they're trying to stay away from each other on the couch. Like, just look at their posture, right?
Yeah.
And what's weird is, neither seem bothered for a second, but then finally, she's like, would you like to sit together? And then they scoot closer, but they look actually less comfortable.
Right.
And
the way he says sure with an ellipsis after, and his posture, you can almost feel him saying it like, sure.
Yeah.
There's like tone in because of the gesture.
Yeah. And I mean, like, very sophisticated writing, so it's like, I would hate for people to get lost in just the style being very simple by like missing that. And then here we find out, okay, so she's thinking about moving to a place called Pillsburg, which is like probably Pittsburgh. But like basically saying like, hey, you'll have an easier time getting a job there. And then we also find out through this exchange, and once again, they're repeating really subtle little movements, but it's the same frame, very animation style. But I just find that so inspiring. And we find out he's kind of worried because it's going to be a big change. And so now we're starting to see the dynamic that's going on between him and Sharon, where she is frustrated that he's not moving, right? that he's not willing to kind of get a job or do anything. And she's also having doubts about his commitment, right? She's saying, like, do you regret us moving in together? And he's like, no, I mean, it's... So once again, like, when he should take action, he's just kind of delaying even in speech, right? So, okay, so now we have this character, and once again, they're finally, like, he's still clearly uncomfortable. She's starting to get more comfortable, and finally he's like thinking he heard Billy Joel, and he's asking, like, hey, is he outside? And she goes, yeah. So he goes to check on Billy Joel, his dog. Once again, you also get the sense from this whole movement and just the way he's designed, like, he's made his whole posture very uncomfortable, a little more stiff than usual. So you get the sense he's trying to escape this conversation too, right? He's not just going to get his dog. He's like, oh, is that a bird I see? Right? So here he goes to get Billy Joel, and get in here, Billy. And I love this. This is classic page turn in comics. Really good trick to use. Look of horror. What is it? You have to flip.
And it's on a page turn.
Mm-hmm. And Billy Joel got the wombat. Which, by the way, again, just look at this expression on Billy Joel. Like, the way that dog is just a shape with, like, the basic info you need. You know? Okay.
And he's so excited.
Yeah, he's happy. And what's funny is anybody who's owned a dog with a backyard, like, probably knows this moment, because dogs.
Well, and if you see, look in the top right versus the top left, it's the same pose, and the only difference is really the ears and the tail. Yeah, and there's a totally different change in mood.
Yeah, and you see massive changes in him, right? It's like the dog is just not phased, but he's had him, like, go through these crazy. He's basically saying, like, drop the wombat, right? It's kind of funny in a weird way. But, they're horrified that he's got this wombat. And finally the owner, like, Sharon, says, drop the wombat. And he drops it and is like, what? This is the owner. And so now we see this uncomfortable, like, heist movie type framing where he finds the wombat and he starts realizing, like, hey, it's dead. But, like, you don't know there's no blood or visual gashes. Like, it's just dirt. So, like, we could pray. And he's concerned about getting sued. You have to keep that in mind. So he's thinking, we'll just wash him and then return him to his cage, and our neighbor will have no idea. And she is, like, adamantly against this. Like, hey, he's dead. We should call her, right? And he's just, like, active suddenly. Like, yeah, no, we got this. And then there's a lot of humor, like, very, like, dead animal humor, but it's very funny. Where he's got the dog, and then he turns on the blow dryer, and suddenly it's like poof. Sorry, the wombat. And then she's, like, saying, "How is this going to save us?" And he's like, "Well, because she's not going to sue us, right?" So they have this whole exchange. He thinks he's just got this brilliant thing that's going to save the day, and once again, she's, like, trying to say, like, hey, she might work better if we own up to it. And he's basically like, she'll also put down your dog, right? Like, for that. So he's like, this is the end of the conversation. So he's going to take care of things. And he's like, I'm going to be back in 5 minutes. And she's, like, I think clearly just kind of horrified. And is like, it's still not right. And her dog's just licking her, which is funny because he just mauled a animal. Okay, so this is very, like, Graham Annable type humor, because he loves doing these, like, spy versus spy kind of bits, where you have a scene and then just eyes pop up.
Yeah,
and then here he's running to the cage, which we were introduced to earlier. And I also want to mention that too, like, for sophistication of story, like, I love that he, like, seeds that one shot, not more than you need, but just so it's in your subconscious. So when it returns to that, you know exactly what it is.
Yeah, even though it's nighttime now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's him, and we're seeing these funny expressions where it's like a man just thinking he's really getting away with it. hops over action movie style, and then boom, we see this is what he's left in this poor woman's cage. So then we have a night sequence, and I don't want to get way too into it, but they end up having a conversation where it becomes clear that she wants him to move and get a job, and he is delaying. And she wants him to commit, and he is delaying. And that like he's been using this raking the yard thing as like a distraction from like actually facing up to his problems and doing something about it. She even mentions, and I love, I don't want to get panel to panel in it, but I love the subtle movements from the same frame where even the dog, right? Like you're getting a sense of time passing with just these little subtle changes and expressions. So anyhow, she's kind of just berating him for, you get the sense this character doesn't do anything, and then he gets really active when he's forced into a corner, right? She drops one thing, which is that she might just go to Pillsbury without him if he doesn't, make up his mind. So here he's like, I think you're getting the sense through the expression that he knows it's serious. And then it's, to black, and we've got the next day. Next day, he's woken by his dog. Anybody who's familiar with my comic knows I got inspiration from this. I actually used that as a paneling device for waking up, was being woken up by a dog, which was true to life. But it's funny, I didn't even think about it. But looking at this right now, I realize I probably logged that in my subconscious.
And Gary's saying here that his eyes just make him look perpetually on edge.
Yes.
Yeah.
Totally. So here he's woken up. He's doing his morning routine. He is eating cereal, talking to the dog, and he's asking the dog. It's a good way to kind of have an internal monologue without having to fall for the gimmick of like the thought balloon, Yeah. But here he's talking to the dog and basically saying, maybe I should look for work instead of working in the yard, right? So here he's heading out. He's ready to go. He's leaving Billy Joel. Billy Joel is just hilarious and very dog-like. And once again, this kind of drawing, I think just things like that require a lot of observation of animals to just know like that's how dogs are.
Right.
Like that movement where it's like from stiff to just kind of strolling away. Once again, just subtle, but really informed, intelligent drawing. So he walks past the neighbors and it's for sale. The neighbor whose wombat died. So that's interesting. So he heads to an old school, like he gets on a bus and heads to an old school employment office with the jobs listing board. And this has like a whole internal struggle with him where he's, basically deciding like which jobs to pick and kind of talking about how he won't get a job. You get the sense of like an internal struggle of like, well, I should just go back home, right? Finally, he decides, you know what? I'm gonna pick this one, but it's probably already taken. And then he's about to leave and he goes, you know what? I'm gonna man up and do it. So now we have a resolved character, right? So goes to the phone, calls about the job, and has a good lead from it. So he's like, okay. So he does a mild interview, and then they'll do a second interview. So good news. Our character who's been delaying is finally taking action, right? So he's excited. Great excited expression. Heading home, and he finally gets home, and Mrs. Anders, which, by the way, again, just let me get in there on this little tiny lady with this giant piece of luggage.
Uh-huh.
Do you see this? I mean, just the subtlety of the line, it just kills me. Even just the hand, just being this little swoop, but you get all the information to know everything about that character, Yeah. Okay. So, and I hope you guys are able to see this okay and stuff. So anyhow, we find out, I realize I'm taking a while, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. So we find out that she is dismayed and moving away because she had a terrible thing happen with her wombat. Cheeves, which is a great name for a wombat that like a woman from the 1950s would give a wombat. So here we go. She explains to him, so Cheeves passed away. And he's like, oh, I'm so sorry, feigning like he's surprised, right? And she's like, so he passed away. She thought he had passed away in his cage and buried him, but wombats play dead. And so he crawled back through the earth and in the process of being buried alive, died and basically like with his last dying breaths crawled back into the cage and died. She is dismayed and he is stoked because he finds out that his dog didn't kill Cheeves, that Cheeves was playing dead, and that she killed Cheeves, and so he's guilt-free.
Yeah.
So he kind of feigns like he's sad. She mentions she's moving away because it's just too hard of memories. He heads back in and he's like happy to tell Sharon, his wife, like, or his girlfriend, you're not going to believe it. Billy Joel didn't maul Cheeves, right? Only to find that, and he's also mentioning like, hey, I'm about to get a job too. And then Billy Joel isn't there. And then we find that there's a note. And by the way, I thought he didn't have a name and I just realized it's Todd.
Yeah.
So that's something I should have mentioned at the top. But anyhow, so here he is reading the letter, and it's pretty clear from just this expression, like it's a goodbye letter, right? So we follow same shot from the bed, but this time it's just him terrified and then disappearing into sleep.
And he's sitting alone in the center of the couch.
Exactly. Right. And finally, so it's repeating from little themes we had where you're pulling from backgrounds and stuff like that. And then at the end, finally, he's sitting there. He's looking at the leaves in the yard. He's looking over at the wombat's cage, looking at the sky. And he decides to get on a bus and head to Pillsburg. And we have the snow falling and this slow exit that goes off, and it was bookended by leaves, branches. So starts with branches and snow, ends with branches. It starts with branches and leaves and ends with branches and snow.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a brilliant story. It's just crazy. So
yeah.
So let's get into like what I feel like the meaning of that is. So it's like
before you jump into meaning, we've got to it's time to balance the books. So let me come over here. I have this pulled up here. So we'll do.
We are the IRS. We need to balance our books.
Yes. So I have my notes up and everything. Here we go. We'll get better at this at some point. All right. The Indie Review Show is brought to you by Audible, and you can get a free audiobook and support this show by going to audibletrial.com/IRS, which I'll put on the screen in a moment. And this week I'm recommending the book The Rook, a novel by Daniel O'Malley, narrated by Susan Dearden. And the narrator is awesome, by the way. But the book is so good. It is really, really phenomenal. And just in my style of just weirdness, this woman, Miffany Thomas, wakes up surrounded by dead bodies wearing gloves. And she has no memory of anything. And it just kind of like goes along with kind of my amnesiac thing from last week. But it turns out that she is a major player in this secret government agency that deals with the supernatural. And it's just really fun. It's a really fun kind of, amnesiac spy thriller, but with like a sci-fi twist. And
That's awesome.
With that link, which is audibletrial.com/IRS, it gives us a little bit of a kickback, but you guys can get a free story and a free trial to do it. And I love Audible. Josh and I both use it all the time. So
yeah, it's funny. Corey and I, like way before, having this with Audible, it's like we've both had multiple conversations about books we've listened to on Audible. I have a long commute, and I also I have to say, if you have a long commute or anything like that, like long periods of time where you're drawing at a table, it's just so fun to listen to an audiobook, and it's a good way to be able to keep up with like books that are out and also be able to be productive at the same time. So yeah, I can't be more stoked.
Yeah. So check out audibletrial.com/IRS if you want to support the show. All right. So let's talk about meaning here.
All right.
Do you want to jump back to us, or do you want to still show the book?
So I'll show the book real quick just to go through the meaning, and then I'll jump back.
Okay.
So it's to me, it's like, delaying and waiting till forced into a position is a terrible way to live, right? Owning mistakes and taking risks can lead to great rewards. And also it functions as just this beautiful exploration of a human relationship. And I feel like this is a really good example of slice of life at its best, where it's got humor, it's got all the elements of kind of a formal story, definitely more strong on the humor end. But because of all the humor interlaced with it, like by the time you have this bus pulling away, I think there's a very heart-tearing moment that's very poignant, and I've only see really often with humor. And so I feel like, to me, this is the highlight of what can be done with the simplicity and the intelligence of a cartoonist like Graham Annable. So I would recommend this and his other work, but I definitely, because of that last story, I think this is a book most cartoonists should own just to learn from it. So
yeah. Victor is saying that that last story is similar to a Jeff Foxworthy joke where a man's dog shows up with a neighbor's pet rabbit dead in its mouth, and Gary was saying that he remembers that joke.
Nice.
And it's really an achievement that something can be so visually stripped down and still be so emotional.
Yeah. So let me pop back in here. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Corey? Are you interested? Are you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I if I'm being honest, there were two main things that I was not interested in when I first saw that on the list. I love Calvin and Hobbes, but I find a lot of stuff that tries to do the genius and gestural simplicity of Watterson tends to fall really short and be just kind of boring.
Yeah.
And so at first glance, I thought, oh, this is just kind of another one of those that it's using stick figures and simple lines and no real detail, and it's or whatever. It's going to be all about the dialogue or whatnot. But just looking at it in depth, the little teeny subtlety of the line work, where one line or one angle changes the entire mood of the character, is awesome. The other thing that I find really entertaining about this, and I think this is going to be a theme of you and I doing this, you have a type, and I love that your type is making the viewer wait for stuff. It's like you get so excited every time we talk about something. You're like, "Oh, look at that! We're slowing the pacing down and making them wait." And I find that really entertaining. That's the thing that you get excited about. It's cool.
I'm
it's
discovering
cool that cartoons can do that.
Yeah, I'm discovering that in this process, because it's like, even thinking about it when you say that, I'm like, one of my favorite sequences in film is in The Graduate. There's this shot at the end, it's like this crazy movie where there's like a guy and he breaks up a wedding and he gets the girl and they get on a bus, and then there's this long shot of them just sitting in the bus going from really excited to just what now, and it's just silence for like 5 minutes, and it's so brilliant. They just stay on that shot, and I do love that. And you're right, that is the thing about me. I do want to say, like, the style and art execution, just overall, simple, extremely subtle, minimal French line style, right? Cartooning at its simplest form. I think the knowledge is displayed is extremely complex, and it requires a great knowledge. And there's a reason Graham has had such a strong career at Lucasfilm and Leica. I just want to reiterate that. And I think it's mainly the focus on weight, movement, emotion, personality, and consistency, right? And then I think there's one last part, and then I really want to hear even more of your thoughts on it and takeaways of it, like maybe if it's something you'll pick up. But I wanted to get into inspiration, like what we can steal, right?
Yeah.
And then I also want to hear what you think we could steal too. But for me, from this, I can steal pacing, which is exactly what Corey was talking about, the pacing. I feel like animators are really in touch with when to repeat the same frame with a subtle movement and emotionally build a scene, because comics and art and story are about emotion. Like if you have, and it doesn't matter if it was Limbo from last week or this book, like where it's in a totally different style. If you don't emote when you're reading it, if you don't have a reason to care about the characters, it could be the most beautiful book in the world and no one's going to care.
Right.
And so I think that's really brilliant. I love the French line style and the loose inking. And I love that comics, broken down to their minimal need to convey a story, it's a good reminder for me, because I tend to get very complex and very hatchy with my work. And I think it's just a good example of, like, the better you get at basic structures in art, you can tell really compelling, funny, humorous stories with like minimal amounts of information. And so I think my main thing from this, and I definitely have drawn it into my work, the stuff I've looked at the most from him is patience, timing, and willingness to stretch out a small scene to build drama or tempo in a story. And then the story structure is really inspirational too, because it's definitely solid stories, even the short ones, the rhymes, all of that. They're all stories with a very clear beginning, middle, and end, and intention. So
yeah, and one of my favorite books on story structure is Invisible Ink, and it's by Brian McDonald, and he titled it that because of what I think Graham is doing really well, which is what people see and hear are the really obvious things.
Yeah.
That, you know, and that's what, but that's not the story. The story beats are the invisible ink, not the actual ink on the page, but like the reason why this is happening, or the, you know, and you look at like, you know, if somebody had to say, like, we're sitting really far apart, like, does that mean that there's tension in our relationship?
Yes.
Like, it would be like, no, just show us that moment.
Yeah.
Right? And then you can revisit that moment to where instead of choosing to sit on the edge of the couch, the character goes to choose and sit in the middle, but now he's alone. And it further emphasizes that aloneness, but it's not like Annable like goes in and like has like a box with an arrow at it that says like, look at all the negative space around this character, he's so lonely. Yeah. Like, you know, or does something like I feel like Family Circus might do, or something where they go in and do like a dotted line of the character where they used to be or something. It's just they trusting the reader to understand the meaning when it's presented in a simple way. I think is something that I need to incorporate into my work a little bit better, because I feel like sometimes I try to bludgeon people. I'm like, I want people to get this point, so I can make it like super obvious. Yeah, but there's a lot of really subtlety, a lot of really good subtlety in the storytelling. That's one thing that really stood out to me that I really like.
Yeah, I love that. Cool. Well, I think, I mean, that pretty much, I will say, like, just for Graham Annabelle's work too, for people to check it out, irisagency.com is going to be our hub. And if you're interested in this book, just please like buy it from that link, because it's an affiliate link and it helps out the show. But I also would recommend like check out Graham's other work as well. And I mean, to me, like one of the best examples of Graham's work outside of comics if you've ever seen Box Trolls, there's a sequence where a baby is taken, and that entire sequence was storyboarded, and I think the animatics were made by Graham. So you can see his framing and patience and subtlety like scattered all throughout that film too. So
yeah. So if you're interested in this book, you can click on this link. That's an affiliate link where we get a kickback. It doesn't cost you anything more than it would normally, and it helps support the show. Also, next week, Scott Circland is going to join us, and he is going to cover a French book, which is still in print in French, but it looks like the English version of it is maybe out of print or a little bit hard to find. So we've got 2 links there for anybody that wants to read ahead. And then 2 weeks from today, I will be covering Lady Killer. So just like always, you can go and you can check out our schedule on the Indie Review Show at irsagency.com.
Mm-hmm.
That'll have the next 4 or 5 episodes, including past episodes. If you missed last week's episode on Limbo, you can go to there and you can see all the previous episodes. We are on Twitch. We are on YouTube. And there's an email newsletter that you can join if you're interested in doing that.
Yeah, and like once again too, we really encourage people to, like, if you want to follow along, that can make the show really fun. We encourage you like check out the books before the show. We have the next 4 weeks up, so we do that intentionally so you guys will have time to hopefully order the book and we can all look at it together. You know?
We need to leave a note because we keep forgetting to talk about this. I love that we're able to include people watching along with us. But if you have read these or want to read along with us, I'd love to hear your thoughts and incorporate that into the show. And so there's an email address on that page at irsagency.com where you can email us a little audio clip or a little video clip that we can play during the show on the air. And we'd love to get your thoughts and feelings on the book, whether you loved it, whether you hated it, what you're going to steal, what you do differently. Any of those type of things. We'd love to get audience reactions kind of in a mailbag situation as well. So
sweet.
Plugs one more time, Josh. Where would you like people to go?
Oh yeah. So I will just pull this up here in the boring black and white area, but 2 stories. Joshua Kimball. So go buy this on Amazon. It helps support the indie book. It's a memoir about faith and mental illness and depravity and ultimately redemption in a fallen world. And then I do want to mention too, on YouTube, on this channel, I've been doing these live streams at almost every night, and Corey shows up on a bunch of them, and they're super fun. So definitely make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell. I also want to mention we're only going to be hosting this show on our channels for a short period of time. So definitely make sure you check out irsagency.com and subscribe to the YouTube link there. That's IRS Agency on YouTube, because that's where we're going to be hosting eventually. We're going to kind of move it all to that hub. So, yeah. And then other than that, like Corey, where can everybody check out your work and find your stuff?
You can find my stuff at coreykerr.com, including animations, comics, and other things that are there. Check out what I'm doing with Jim Lujan right now. We're about to change things. We're about to finish an animation that we've been collaborating on for 6 to 8 weeks, and you can check all those episodes out at coreykerr.com/chains. And so you can check that out. But yeah, go jump over to the new YouTube channel, because we will be transitioning. We'll do this a couple more times in each of our channels, and then we'll be doing it over there. So if you don't want to miss future shows, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell and all that jazz. Okay. We'll catch you guys next week, same time.